I always thought my stepson was just a reserved, shy kid, but what I walked in on that quiet Sunday afternoon changed everything. It wasn't just what he was doing, it was how I felt when our eyes met. The vulnerability, the tension, it stirred something I couldn't ignore. At that moment, I knew our lives would never be the same again. What happened next? Even I couldn't have predicted it. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon, quiet and unremarkable. The kind of day where the house felt more like a comforting cocoon than a space shared by others. My husband was out with his fishing buddies, enjoying one of his impromptu weekend getaways, leaving the house unusually serene. For once it was just me and my stepson, Kyle. Kyle had always been a unique presence in my life. At 22, he carried himself with a blend of youthful confidence and an endearing awkwardness. He had a reserved demeanor, one that often made him seem distant, but those close to him knew it wasn't indifference, it was shyness. Over the years, we had forged a quiet bond. It wasn't the kind of relationship that drew attention. It was subtle, built on shared understanding and unspoken trust. That afternoon, I had busied myself with chores, trying to fill the empty silence. The faint sound of music trickled down from Kyle's room, a steady bassline that was as much a part of the house as the ticking of the clock. It was a rare opportunity to be alone together in the house, though our interactions had always been comfortably mundane. Passing conversations about his classes, his part-time job, or the latest TV shows he enjoyed. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and stood by the kitchen window, letting the sunlight stream in. It was the kind of moment that usually brought peace, but that day, a restless energy buzzed in my chest. I couldn't place it, an inexplicable feeling, as if something was about to change. Deciding to check on Kyle, I made my way upstairs. His door was slightly ajar, the music softer now, almost inviting. It was typical for him to get lost in his own world, and I respected his need for space. But as I hesitated outside his room, I couldn't shake the nagging curiosity. It was the kind of curiosity that had always seemed harmless, but that day, it led me to something I wasn't prepared for. Our relationship had always been grounded in routine and safety. But as I stood outside his door, I had no idea that I was about to cross a line that would change everything. The door to Kyle's room was slightly ajar, the soft hum of his music floating into the hallway. I hesitated, my hand poised to knock. It wasn't unusual for him to spend hours tucked away in his room, immersed in his music or the latest online game. But something about the stillness in the air felt different, almost charged. I told myself it was nothing, just a motherly instinct overreacting. Yet, I couldn't shake the urge to peek inside, to ensure everything was okay. When I finally pushed the door open, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Kyle sat on the edge of his bed, his posture relaxed but focused. His hands moved with an intent I couldn't immediately decipher, his brow furrowed in concentration. My breath caught as the scene before me became clear. The intimate nature of his actions left me frozen, a mix of shock and confusion rooting me to the spot. I should have turned away. I should have quietly retreated and given him the privacy he believed he had. But something about the moment, the vulnerability etched across his face, the unguarded way he seemed lost in his thoughts, held me captive. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the raw, unfiltered emotion I glimpsed in him. For a moment, Kyle wasn't just my stepson. He was a young man, grappling with feelings and needs he probably didn't fully understand. Suddenly, Kyle looked up. His eyes met mine, and time seemed to stop. The embarrassment on his face was immediate, his cheeks flushing a deep red as he scrambled to cover himself. My heart pounded in my chest, a chaotic rhythm that drowned out every logical thought. I didn't think you'd come upstairs, he stammered, his voice thick with mortification. I'm sorry, I blurted, stepping back instinctively. I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking. Kyle nodded quickly, avoiding my gaze. Just give me a minute, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I retreated down the hallway, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Why hadn't I just knocked? Why hadn't I turned away the moment I realized what was happening? But most of all, why couldn't I erase the image of his vulnerable expression from my mind? Downstairs, I gripped the kitchen counter, my knuckles white as I tried to steady my breathing. The house, once so quiet and comforting, now felt heavy, suffocating. My mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. The sight of Kyle wasn't just shocking, it stirred something deep within me, something I couldn't name. It wasn't attraction, not in the way one might think. It was an unsettling mix of protectiveness and curiosity, as if I had glimpsed a side of him I was never meant to see. When Kyle finally came downstairs later that evening, the awkward tension between us was palpable. He mumbled an apology, his movements stiff and hesitant. I tried to play it off, to reassure him that it wasn't a big deal, but the words felt hollow. Something had shifted between us, an invisible line crossed that neither of us could ignore. Over the next few days, I found myself watching Kyle more closely. His usual confidence seemed shaken, replaced by a quiet introspection. He avoided eye contact, his interactions with me clipped and cautious. And yet, there were moments, fleeting glances, subtle shifts in his posture, that hinted at something else. Was it guilt? Embarrassment? Or was it something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit even to himself? As the days passed, the tension only grew. I couldn't help but notice the way he lingered in the doorway when we spoke, or how his eyes seemed to search mine as if looking for reassurance. Each moment felt charged, layered with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more impossible it became to deny. Whatever had happened that afternoon wasn't going to simply fade away. It had left a mark, one that neither of us could erase. The days following that moment in Kyle's room were anything but ordinary. The atmosphere between us had shifted subtly, like the faint change in the air before a storm. It wasn't just awkwardness, it was something deeper, something unspoken that lingered in the quiet moments we shared. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting discomfort that would eventually fade. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more present it became. Kyle began spending more time around me, though he didn't seem to realize it. He would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, or sit in the living room while I read. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that mirrored my own. And then there were the glances, those lingering looks that made my heart race in ways I couldn't understand. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was the way his gaze seemed to hold a question, one he wasn't ready to ask. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I heard him approach. His footsteps were soft, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether to come closer. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I glanced over my shoulder, offering a small smile. "Sure. You can dry." He moved to stand beside me, grabbing a dish towel. For a few minutes, we worked in silence, the only sounds the clink of dishes and the running water. But the silence felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. "Kyle," I began, my voice softer than I intended, "are you okay? You've been quiet lately." He hesitated, his hands stilling for a moment before he placed a plate on the counter. "Yeah, I guess. Just thinking about stuff." I turned to face him, drying my hands on a towel. "What kind of stuff?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. "Life, I guess. Expectations. You know, the usual." I nodded, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I'm here for you." He offered a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know." But as he turned back to his task, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wanted to say more, that he was holding something back. And deep down, I knew what it was, even if I wasn't ready to admit it to myself. The tension came to a head one night when we found ourselves alone in the living room. I was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over my legs, while Kyle sat in the armchair across from me. The TV played softly in the background, but neither of us was really paying attention. My eyes flicked toward him, and I caught him watching me. He quickly looked away, but not before I saw the conflicted expression on his face. "Kyle," I said gently, breaking the silence. He looked up, his gaze hesitant but steady. "Yeah. Is there something you want to talk about?" My voice was calm, but my heart pounded in my chest. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I don't know how to say it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just say it," I encouraged. "Whatever it is, I won't judge you." He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting mine. "I've been feeling different. About us. About you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with meaning. My breath caught, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. The rational part of me screamed to shut this down, to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But another part of me, the part that had felt the same shift in our dynamic, couldn't look away. "Kyle," I said finally, my voice trembling, "I don't think we should." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm but laced with emotion. "I know it's wrong. I know it's complicated. But I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. He wasn't wrong. As much as I wanted to deny it, to pretend everything was fine, I couldn't. Something between us had changed, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, it wasn't going away. I looked away, my hands gripping the blanket tightly. This isn't something we can just act on, Kyle. It's not right. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just needed you to know. To be honest about how I feel. The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me, and I looked back at him, my own emotions raw and exposed. Kyle, I care about you. More than I probably should. But it's complicated. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. I just don't want to lose you. You won't, I promised, though my voice wavered. But we have to figure out where to go from here. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the line we had crossed. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing between us would ever be the same again. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, each shared moment between Kyle and me charged with unspoken tension. We tiptoed around the truth, careful not to let our emotions spill over into something we couldn't control. But that kind of restraint couldn't last forever. The more we tried to ignore what was brewing, the more impossible it became to deny. It happened late one night, the kind of night where the world outside seemed impossibly still, leaving the two of us alone with nothing but our thoughts. My husband was still away on one of his many weekend trips, leaving the house eerily quiet. I had been tossing and turning in bed, my mind replaying every interaction with Kyle, every look, every word. Sleep eluded me, so I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water, hoping the movement would calm my restless thoughts. As I descended the stairs, I noticed the faint glow of a light coming from the living room. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. Kyle was there, sitting on the couch, his face illuminated by the soft light of a lamp. He didn't notice me at first, his head resting in his hands, his posture slumped. There was something about the way he sat, so still and vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. "Kyle!" I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. There was a rawness in his gaze, a vulnerability that left me frozen. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply, his voice low and hoarse. "Me neither." I hesitated before stepping closer, unsure of what to say or do. "Do you want to talk about it?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What's there to say?" I sat down beside him, leaving enough space between us to feel safe, but close enough to offer comfort. "You've been carrying a lot lately. I can see it." Kyle looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to find the right words. "It's not just what I'm carrying, it's everything. How I feel. About you. About us." My breath caught, the confession hanging in the air between us. I wanted to say something, to defuse the tension, but no words came. The silence grew, heavy and oppressive, until Kyle finally broke it. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I've tried, but I can't. And it's not fair to you. Or me. Kyle, this isn't something we can." I trailed off, my voice faltering under the weight of what I wanted to say. "It's not right." "I know it's not," he said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't make it go away." The tears in his eyes caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. The touch was meant to comfort, but it did something else entirely. It bridged the distance between us, pulling us into a moment that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Kyle," I began, but he shook his head, his hand covering mine. "Please don't tell me this isn't real," he said, his voice breaking. "I know it is. I know you feel it too." I opened my mouth to argue, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. As much as I wanted to deny it, to pretend this was all a misunderstanding, I couldn't. The connection between us was real, undeniable. And in that moment, it felt like the weight of the world fell away, leaving only the two of us. Kyle leaned in, his movements hesitant, as if giving me a chance to stop him. I should have pulled away, told him this was wrong. But I didn't. Instead, I let him close the distance, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, almost reverent. The contact sent a jolt through me, a warmth spreading from where our lips met and radiating through my entire body. For a moment, everything else faded away, the house, the rules, the consequences. There was only him, only us, caught in a moment that felt both fragile and all-consuming. But as the kiss deepened, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We can't." "I know," Kyle said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "But it doesn't change how I feel. And it doesn't change the fact that you feel it too." I stood, putting distance between us, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. "We can't do this, Kyle. It's not just about us. There are other people involved, your dad, our family. Kyle stood too, his expression one of determination. I'm not asking you to choose me. I needed you to know. To be honest about how I feel. Even if nothing comes of it. The raw honesty in his voice broke something inside me, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to comfort him, to reassure him that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Because I didn't know if it would be. I care about you, Kyle, I said finally, my voice trembling. More than I probably should. But we have to think about what this means. What this could do to everyone around us. I know, he said quietly, his gaze never leaving mine. I just don't want to lose you. You won't, I promised, though the words felt hollow. Because deep down, I knew things could never go back to the way they were. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the truth we had been avoiding for so long. And as Kyle reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a silent gesture of connection, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, guilt, and a longing I couldn't deny. Whatever came next, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when everything between us felt so fragile, so real. We would have to face the consequences of our actions eventually. But for now, all we could do was take it one moment at a time, navigating the fragile, dangerous bond that had formed between us. And as I turned and walked back up the stairs, leaving Kyle alone in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with twists and turns I couldn't predict. But one thing was clear. Our lives had changed forever, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion, each one heavier than the last. The air in the house felt suffocating, every shared glance with Kyle charged with an unspoken tension. We avoided being alone together as much as possible, both of us painfully aware of the line we had crossed. But no matter how much distance we tried to put between us, the reality of what had happened loomed over us like a storm cloud, impossible to ignore. My husband returned from his trip, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. His presence should have brought a sense of normalcy, a reminder of the life we had before everything changed. But instead, it felt like a spotlight, shining on the cracks that had formed in the foundation of our family. Every word, every interaction, was laced with an undercurrent of guilt that neither Kyle nor I could hide. I found myself avoiding my husband, unable to meet his eyes without feeling a pang of shame. The guilt was a constant weight, gnawing at me in quiet moments. What had I done? How had I let things spiral so far out of control? And yet, despite the guilt, I couldn't deny the pull I still felt toward Kyle. It was a dangerous, all-consuming feeling that both terrified and exhilarated me. Kyle, too, was struggling. He became more withdrawn, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet tension. He avoided his father, barely speaking more than a few words at a time. It didn't take long for my husband to notice the shift in Kyle's behavior. "What's going on with him?" he asked one evening as we sat on the couch. "He's been so quiet lately. Is everything okay?" I froze, the question hitting me like a punch to the gut. "He's probably just stressed," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "You know how he gets when things pile up." My husband nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Maybe I should talk to him." The thought made my stomach churn. "Give him some space," I said, trying to sound casual. "He'll come around." But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that space wasn't helping. The tension in the house was palpable, and my husband's concern only grew. Meanwhile, Kyle and I found ourselves drawn together in ways we couldn't explain or control. One night, after my husband had gone to bed, I found Kyle in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, staring at a cup of tea as though it held all the answers to the questions swirling in his mind. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to approach him or retreat to the safety of my room. "Kyle," I said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing that made my chest tighten. "Are you okay?" He shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." I sat down across from him, my heart pounding. "Talk to me," I said. "Please." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I can't stop thinking about what happened. About us." My breath caught, and I felt the familiar wave of guilt wash over me. "Kyle, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "I know we can't. But that doesn't make it any easier." His honesty was like a knife to my heart. I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. I know it's hard, I said, my voice trembling. But we have to move past this. For your dad. For our family. Kyle nodded, but his expression was one of defeat. I don't know if I can, he admitted. Every time I see you, it's all I can think about. I pulled my hand back, the weight of his words too much to bear. We don't have a choice, Kyle. We have to find a way to move forward. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us both freeze. My husband appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. What's going on? He asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Nothing, I said quickly, standing up and forcing a smile. Kyle couldn't sleep, so we were just talking. My husband's gaze shifted between us, his expression unreadable. It's late, he said finally. You both should get some rest. Kyle stood, avoiding his father's gaze as he mumbled a good night and disappeared down the hallway. I followed suit, retreating to my room with my heart pounding in my chest. The near miss left me shaken, the realization of just how precarious our situation had become sinking in. Over the next few days, I threw myself into maintaining a facade of normalcy, determined to keep the cracks in our family from showing. But no matter how hard I tried, the truth was always there, lurking beneath the surface. The fallout of our actions had begun, and there was no escaping it. Kyle and I had set something in motion that couldn't be undone, and the weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. The days turned into weeks, and the suffocating weight of the situation finally began to settle into a grim kind of normalcy. Kyle and I avoided being alone together, and the conversations we did have were stilted and cautious, each of us tiptoeing around the subject that lingered between us. My husband remained blissfully unaware, but the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. It was as though we were all walking on eggshells, waiting for the inevitable to crack the fragile surface. One quiet evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. My mind was a whirlwind, replaying every decision, every misstep, every moment that had brought us here. The guilt was a constant companion, a dull ache that never quite went away. Kyle entered the room hesitantly, his presence pulling me from my thoughts. He stood there for a moment, as though debating whether to speak. Finally, he said, "Can we talk?" I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He took a seat across from me, his posture tense but his expression earnest. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "About everything. About us." I swallowed hard, bracing myself for what was coming. "Cull, we've talked about this. We can't." "I know," he interrupted, his eyes meeting mine. "And you're right. We can't. But I can't keep living like this either. It's not fair to you, or to me, or to Dad." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I don't know how we fix this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't even know where to start." Kyle leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he clasped his hands together. "We start by being honest. With ourselves. With each other." I nodded slowly, his words settling heavily in my chest. "You're right," I said softly. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen. But we also can't let it define us." The conversation stretched late into the night, both of us laying our emotions bare in a way we hadn't before. We talked about the confusion, the guilt, and the longing that had brought us to this point, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could find a way forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Kyle and I worked to rebuild the boundaries we had so recklessly crossed. It was awkward and painful, but it was necessary. I poured myself into repairing my relationship with my husband, determined to reclaim the life I had almost destroyed. And Kyle, to his credit, began to open up to his father in ways he hadn't before, finding a new kind of connection that had been missing for years. Looking back, I realized that what had happened between Kyle and me wasn't just about attraction or forbidden feelings. It was about loneliness, about vulnerability, about two people searching for something they couldn't find in their own lives. And while it was wrong, it had also forced me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. I learned the hard way that boundaries exist for a reason, and crossing them has consequences that ripple far beyond the people involved. But I also learned that redemption is possible, even in the wake of our biggest mistakes. It takes honesty, humility, and a willingness to change. As I sat in the quiet of the living room one evening, watching Kyle and my husband laughing together over some old story, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I believed we could face it together. Because no matter how broken things had become, there was always hope for healing, and for finding our way back to the people we were meant to be. If you were in my shoes, how would you handle it? Could you move forward and repair what was broken, or would the weight of your actions hold you back forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that explore the complexities of relationships and the unexpected turns life can take. Stay tuned for what's next.